It's pretty obvious that Halo Season 1 was very divisive amongst fans. I finally sat down to watch the entire season and I'm here to give my thoughts. I have to say, I didn't hate it. I remember years ago that there was a Halo movie in development, but it never got off the ground. It was basically in development hell. And then a few years ago, we heard about this Halo series for Showtime and then eventually Paramount Plus. During shooting and leading up to the marketing, we were hearing all these rumors of what this show was going to be. And then we got our first look at the show, and then we heard about more things that potentially was going to be in the show after the marketing was released, people having theories, and then the whole season came out slowly over time. And yeah, divisive is the nice way to say it. Obviously for me, I was going into watching the show with all the episodes already out, but I was avoiding pretty much all discussion about the show, good or bad, because I really wasn't paying too much attention. But I remember seeing the trailers leading up to the release and going, it looks good in areas, not so good in other areas. I have some issues here and there, but I don't know. But I finally sat down to watch the all 9 episodes, and yeah, there's a lot of things I want to say. Let's talk about why people were tuning into this show for the most part. Of course, we're talking about Master Chief. I could literally spend a lot of time talking just about Master Chief in this show, but then that would kind of take away from the rest of the things I do want to discuss. So this is what I'm going to say. Master Chief in this show is definitely not the Master Chief that I'm used to. And from that standpoint, I had to just continue with the show, understanding that this is a adaptation, this is a different interpretation of the source material, and that they're trying to tell their own version of the story, and then I have to just accept that. Now, with me accepting that does not mean that I agree with the choices that were made or say, oh, this makes sense. Because for me, literally at times, mostly, he felt like a completely different character. Like when he puts on the suit, he has, of course, the armor on. Looks like Master Chief. Pretty good design. But he's definitely not acting like it. And it could be attributed to the fact of the artifact, of course, that he touches and he starts to have thoughts and memories and seeing these visions, and it's starting to have him questioning a lot of things. And that's what I thought they were going to be leaning towards with him removing his helmet in episode 1 to Quan. I thought that was because of touching the artifact and he's starting to have these thoughts and he's starting to change, essentially. Turns out, no, it's actually not a story point for why he takes off his helmet. Like, that's not the story point. They literally just take off their helmets. Him and the rest of the Spartans we follow, they just take the helmets off. So that's just out the window. I thought there was actually a story reason, because in episode 1 we only see him remove his helmet. And I'm thinking, okay, it's because of the artifact. It's actually not at all. And I know some people are going to go, we've heard this argument over and over and over in regards to the helmet removing, just let it go. But for me, it just felt kind of strange, because at times this show as a whole felt like a Halo show. Sometimes. Other times, like, okay, they could have just called this something else, but they used a recognizable IP and made it into a Halo show, but they literally could have just made a sci-fi show with this budget, and I think it would have maybe come across better, because there's a lot of people that are very, against this show for many of the things that they did with this season. Obviously, we have a season 2 coming, so we'll see what they do with Master Chief, but I just felt at times this just feels like a completely different character. Like, we literally could have made a Halo show. We could have followed somebody else besides John. We could have followed somebody else entirely, and they were the main focus of this Halo show. But they decided to go because the recognizable name, John 117, Master Chief, that we have to follow him when we could have followed somebody else as being a Spartan. I want to get to this part next because literally it really frustrated me and it made me question watching the show at times, like continuing to watch it and finish the first season, was Quan. I have nothing against the actor portraying the character. I have nothing against her because she signed on to play this part and she got paid and all that. My issue is the fact that they made Quan go from this character that Master Chief rescued and was taking back to, of course, Reach, and literally everything just kind of fell apart once him and her separated in episode 2, because I thought that maybe we'll see Quan a little bit later, but literally we kept following her throughout the remainder of episodes up to episode 7, and then from there, if I remember correctly, we don't see her again after episode 7, which was a centric Quan episode. Her storyline after separating with Chief, I really just didn't have a connection with it. The opening sequence in, of course, episode 1 with basically her father and all these people getting killed. She's the only survivor. The elite's attacking everything, and there's this giant fight. And we see the Spartans, of course, Master Chief, all of them, Silver Team. Like, all of that I think was interesting. And then when her and Master Chief by themselves, and the whole thing about where he doesn't kill her when he's ordered to, and there's a whole thing, of course, with the ship and all of that, I thought that was interesting for sure. But once Quan was by herself away from Chief, and they were following that storyline with her returning back to her homeworld, trying to rise up and start the rebellion again against this tyrant who's a typical villain. And I recognize the actor, I just couldn't care less about his character or this whole storyline because I just didn't feel a connection. And I'm okay with shows having multiple storylines. I watch a lot of shows with multiple storylines happening where you have the A plot, the main plot, and then you have a couple B plots or whatever that are taking up some time as well within episodes throughout a season. But with her storyline, I just didn't feel a connection. I felt like it really was just taking away from the stuff that I was at least somewhat interested in seeing, and we're following her stuff, and I just could care less. And that's something I was noticing, that there was a lot of people having issues with the fact that this storyline could have been interesting, but they were just making decisions, just the way they approached it. People just were connected with it. And maybe it's partly due to the fact that there was people that were already against the show from the get-go and watching it and just having a lot of critiques and issues, and that may be some people's problems. But in regards to my personal response, I just literally was sitting there just waiting for it to cut back to Chief or somebody in relation to the main plot of the show. And I just sat there and went, oh my gosh, again, okay, we're back here. And then with the entirety of episode 7 just focused on her, I was at a point thinking, do I even continue with the last 2 episodes? Do I even continue? And I'm glad that I did, because I have more things to say when we get towards the end. But yeah, the Quan stuff could have easily been scrapped, and something else could have been added in, or they could have had Quan not separate from Chief. They could have went with that direction, but instead they went the direction they did, and I felt like it was the wrong choice. I want to get into now the CGI of the show, because there was a lot of discussion about the look of the show and the design of course, the Covenant and everything. I want to say this. I think overall, not picking out and nitpicking small little things here or there, I feel like overall the CGI was pretty good, pretty solid. And I felt like, okay, they're using their budget mostly in a good way in terms of like it actually looks like Halo at times in terms of the Covenant ships, the elites, the grunts, like all of that, and even the weapons all looked good. And of course, the Spartan armor, I've already talked about Chief and everything, but the rest of Silver Team, I felt like they did a really good job of the design work and the CGI, of course, of Reach City and the other planets we went to. I think it all looked pretty good. But when you get into those small moments where there's certain moments during a fight sequence where it's really clunky when a CG model of a character does something that obviously is not a person in a suit doing this, it's just too fantastical, so they have to do a CG render of that character, and it comes across and it feels really odd. That's where it kind of takes you out of it, because if you are fully believing and you are fully immersed into the story, like in the opening, as I mentioned once before, the opening fight in episode 1 with the elites and the Spartans, I think overall that was a great fight. However, there were small little moments in there where it took me out of it, because I'm like, oh, that was a bad moment. Like, why couldn't they polish on that a little bit? Because clearly they spend a lot of time on certain things like the elites and making them look really detailed, and the fight sequences were, I think, overall choreographed pretty solid. But there was like moments where, like, there's one particular moment where Chief jumps from one spot to another and it's clunky. It feels weird. It's awkward. And there's another point where he throws his rifle to the ground and it cuts to it and it's a weird shot. Like, it's too quick too. It just, certain moments like that, just kind of strange. I just really felt like they could have polished some things, because if they would have worked on those moments that just feel weird and just don't feel, it takes you out of the immersion essentially, and they don't notice that, that's a bad sign. But if they couldn't have just worked a little bit more on that, I think this would have been received better in terms of the actual design and the CG work. But with those small moments and things that just make you go, that was a weird choice, that looks kind of strange, it overall, like, lowers down the overall quality of what people are looking for in terms of, the design of these of certain creatures, the covenant and everything, and the suits or whatever, and just like the ships. It just overall hurts it, when certain things like that just stand out. There was a lot of discussion, of course, about the final episode of the show where Cortana takes complete control of Chief, and she says, "I don't know if I'll be able to bring you back," and she's just controlling him, and the show just ends on that note. And it made me wonder, they're not going to go the route of Chief just being silent. Eventually they're going to find a way to bring him back, I would assume, because imagine the show continued for the rest, however long it lasts, and Chief just never comes back. He's just dead forever, and Cortana's just taking control of him. I don't know. I felt it was a weird choice to end it there on that note. But I guess since it wasn't like a happy ending per se with this finale, but it also, I guess they wanted to try to find that middle ground where they did save both artifacts and they have it back on the ship. They're leaving and they destroyed a bunch of Covenant or whatever. But also Chief, he sacrificed himself so that Cortana could take over. I guess. I mean, they've been talking about the fact that Cortana was made to take over his body to control him. So I guess they thought, well, we might as well just have this as a reveal because we keep talking about it. So we might as well have her do it. It was just kind of a weird choice. The thing is that this show had the potential to be great. It did. And in some instances, I think it was getting there in terms of certain characters, certain moments, the fight sequences overall, of course not nitpicking certain things. I felt like there were some elements that made this show overall work better than I thought it would. Because I honestly was expecting, as I was continuing, that I was going to go, nah, I'm going to stop. I can't continue this. But I was always finding certain things that I was like, okay, I gotta see where this is going. What's gonna happen here? I have to see how it's gonna unfold. And that may be to some people going like, it felt like you were pushing yourself. Maybe at some points, especially episode 7, where I really was just questioning everything, but I was already invested in terms of what the story they were trying to tell in terms of these artifacts and finding Halo and everything. I'm like, okay, regardless of my issue with the side storyline and everything, and just certain things, I'm just like, I don't know about that. Okay, whatever. I got to see how it ends. I got to see at least where season 1 ends. Now, I think with season 2, because we know we're getting it, I think with that, I'm going to really be more, cautious, because I already know what the show has now done in terms of its first season. And there are certain critiques that's been thrown at the show that they cannot do. They can't really do, because it would fundamentally change the show. You might as well just reboot it. And some people might say, reboot the damn show. But there are certain critiques that can be taken in by the writers and the showrunner to make season 2 a little bit more to what, take more about what was strong about the series. And some people might say there wasn't anything good about it. There was nothing strong or positive about it. And that's fine. But for me, in terms of the main storyline about where Chief and Cortana, which overall Cortana, as it continued, I actually overall think her design is solid. Now, at first I was really, it was jarring to see her design in the trailers leading up to the release of the show. But after now seeing it more of in context and just watching the show, I'm like, okay. The design of Cortana is definitely different from the games, but at the same time, this adaptation, they're making changes and it is what it is. But in regards to the certain things that I think worked for the show, I'm hoping that season 2 will improve on those certain things. I hope so. I guess gotta be optimistic for that. I want the show to work. I really do, because I feel like the Halo IP has a lot of potential. And I was excited for that film. But with this show, it just kind of showed me that they get some things right, but a lot of stuff they either miss the mark or they get so off the beaten path of what we traditionally would think of in terms of thinking of Halo that it makes me go, what were they thinking there? But then again, there was that infamous interview that came out saying that we didn't look at the games, we don't talk about the games when they were making the show, they were just kind of avoiding all of that. And I understand to a certain extent why they may be so pushed back against it, because they wanted to do their own, like they wanted to tell their own story. They didn't want too much influence off the games. But it's not bad if you want to look at them as guidance for what the show did. Like they literally looked at the games they had to have, because they literally were doing POV shots just like from the games, and showing POV shots while there's fight sequences going on. So like literally, and it looked like the game at times when they were doing the POV shots of Chief's helmet. Like it really felt like, okay, they did look at the games, they did, but I guess they were kind of avoiding the story aspect. But I feel like it's not it's not a bad thing to look at the games as, guidance to kind of see how did they tell their story. Video games and television are two very separate things in terms of narration, like narrative storytelling. Narration, get my point. It's two separate things, but to sit there and say we're not looking at the games, we're steering clear of that. Look at it for guidance of how they told their story. Okay, there is major differences, of course, but you're basing your show off of the video games and the novels and everything revolving around Halo. You're basing the show off of that. So don't just dismiss it because you're worried it's going to influence or make you decide to make changes or whatever based on the games. Like, just set your limitations on what you're looking at to take from the games that you think would work for your narrative you're trying to tell, regardless of the response of the public, because the public have spoken mostly for what they feel about this show. So I don't know. I feel like they should have just approached it a little bit differently. There's obviously more things I could say about season 1 of Halo, but at the end of the day, I overall walked away going, okay, we'll see what happens in season 2. Like, I wanted to love it. I wanted to really care for it. There were certain things I felt, okay. Certain things, not so much. And you're probably wondering why I didn't really talk about the Blessed One. I really don't want to get into the Blessed One storyline and tying into Chief and what happens, I believe, was episode 8. My God. I really don't want to get into that because I'll just sit here all day just going on and on and on and on, and I'll just end up cutting it. And so I'm like, I'll just be talking and spending time recording when I literally will just cut all this because it's just rambling, because what were they thinking with that? I don't know. But anyways, that's my overall thoughts about season 1. Some of my issues, some of my positives, at least I did give. I feel like this show could have been a lot better, but then again, I think it could have been a lot worse. But then there's people are saying, no, it was the worst thing ever. But for me, I just feel there's certain things they could have approached differently and they could have done better. But we'll see. Maybe season 2 will be an improvement, and I hope it is. Even if they fix a few minor things that I had issues with regarding while watching the show, even if they fix a few things, I'll see that as a good thing, because I feel they're probably not going to listen to a lot of the criticism. They're probably going to go, we're going to make our show how we want, and we're not going to give a shit. And that's fine, because sometimes you have to go, we're going to just block out all of the response, positive and negative, and just tell our story no matter what people are saying, because we want to stick with our story. And that's fine. But there's also some critiques that isn't about telling you how to change your story. There's a lot of stuff in regards to how they told their story. But they could look at certain critiques that maybe they can go, okay, well, that's not going to change our narrative. That's going to be something that we could work on in terms of the visual effects, or something to where how we progress it. Not so much, us, like what story we want to tell, but how we're telling it. They get to see little small things like that. But maybe they have to stick with their guns and go, we're not going to listen to criticism. But I don't know. The show, this show could have been so much to so many people, and there was a lot of people that were really disappointed with it. And for me, I wish I could have loved it. I really wish I did. I unfortunately didn't. So what do you think of the Halo Season 1 overall? The Halo Season 1. You get my point. It's been a long day. What do you think of Halo Season 1, guys? I'm curious to know your thoughts. And whatever thoughts you have, let me know in the comments below. The things you liked, the things you didn't like, whatever thoughts, like I said, in the comments below. I will talk to you guys soon. Peace out.